Welcome to one of the most haunting stories ever told in Savannah, Georgia. The year was 1839, a time when Savannah was still called the Jewel of the South. Its streets were lined with old oak trees heavy with Spanish moss, their long shadows stretching across the cobblestone streets. The warm, moist air carried whispers and gossip that moved from the grand mansions on Abercorn Street to the quiet servant quarters hidden behind them. It all began with a small notice printed in the Savannah Morning Republican on April 3, 1839. It was a short announcement that many readers might have easily missed. A marriage license had been issued to widow Elizabeth Thornton, age 42, and a man named James Bennet, age 26. What the newspaper didn't mention was that James Bennet had, until recently, been considered property, not a free man, on the Thornton plantation. The scandal that followed would not only destroy the Thornton family's reputation, but would also uncover secrets buried deep within Savannah's polite society. Elizabeth Thornton, born Elizabeth Montgomery, came from one of Georgia's oldest and richest families. Her grandfather had arrived in the colony in 1733 with General Oglethorpe himself. Over the generations, the Montgomerys had grown wealthy from their rice plantations along the Savannah River, wealth earned from the forced labor of hundreds of enslaved people. Elizabeth grew up in luxury in the family's large three-story mansion on Reynolds Square. Parish records from Christ Church Episcopal show that she married at just 17 years old to Richard Thornton, a widower 28 years older than her, who owned a large cotton plantation just outside the city. Their marriage united two of Georgia's most powerful families. Richard's first wife had died during childbirth, leaving behind a young son, William, who was only 5 years younger than his new stepmother. According to the Journal of Mary Benny, a cousin who visited the Thornton plantation in the summer of 1826, the household was managed with quiet discipline. Mary wrote that Elizabeth seemed gentle and refined but ruled her home firmly, maintaining strict order among the servants. Richard spoke little during meals, and when he did, an uneasy silence always followed. People who knew the family said Richard often traveled on business to Charleston or Augusta, leaving Elizabeth in charge of the estate. Few people realized how much time she spent with a house servant named Grace, listed in household records. Grace had arrived in 1822, purchased from a trader in Charleston. She did not come alone. With her came her young son, a 9-year-old boy named James. By 1835, tax records from Chatham County listed 47 enslaved people living on the Thornton plantation. Among them, James Bennet was listed as a house servant, one of only 4 with that title. Most of the others worked long hours in the cotton fields, their names replaced with numbers in the inventory books. But James's name appeared often in household accounts, first as Grace's boy, then as simply James, and finally as James Bennet. The appearance of a surname was rare and has puzzled historians for generations. Dr. Eleanor Hammond, who studied the Thornton papers in 1963 before they mysteriously disappeared from the Georgia Historical Society archives, wrote that James had been taught to read and write, a remarkable fact for someone in his position. In her lost manuscript Whispers from Reynolds Square, Hammond mentioned that ledgers showed purchases of books, slates, and pencils for J.B.'s instruction. When Richard Thornton died during the yellow fever outbreak of 1836, his will left everything to Elizabeth and provided his son William with a large inheritance, but one strange clause stood out. "The servant James Bennet shall remain in the employ of my wife and shall not be sold or transferred under any circumstances." Years later, that one line would become the center of heated legal debates when the scandal finally broke. Elizabeth mourned her husband for exactly 1 year before she began appearing in public again. Neighbors noted that the plantation continued running smoothly, even without its master. But during that time, people began to notice things that made them uneasy. Margaret Habersham, a nearby resident, told investigators that she had seen Elizabeth and James walking together in the garden, not as mistress and servant, but as equals, speaking quietly like close companions. A former kitchen maid, Sarah Johnson, later testified that she once entered the study without knocking and found the two standing close together. James had quickly pulled his hand away from Elizabeth's arm. "They jumped apart like they'd been burned," she said. "Mrs. Thornton sent me away quick, but her face was red like I'd never seen before." The seasons passed, winter to spring, spring to summer, and the Thornton house grew quieter. Elizabeth stopped attending social gatherings. Her cousin, Thomas Montgomery, wrote in a letter that he visited her in early 1838 and found her changed, distracted, strangely cheerful, and dressed more simply than before. He noticed that James served their tea, and Elizabeth spoke to him with a familiarity that unsettled him deeply. He wrote, "She said she had never felt more alive. There was something in her eyes I did not recognize, something like secret joy." A series of urgent letters soon followed between William Thornton and his uncle, Judge Henry Thornton. William wrote in December 1838 that he had received troubling reports about his stepmother's behavior and planned to visit the plantation without warning. Judge Henry replied, urging caution, but warned that there have been whispers in certain circles. Handle this quietly before it becomes a public scandal. William arrived at the plantation on January 15, 1839, during a cold, heavy rain. The next morning the sheriff was summoned after what reports described as a disturbance of serious nature. What exactly happened that night was never fully recorded. All that is known is that William left before dawn and went straight to the sheriff's office. By noon, James Bennet had been arrested, though the charges were quickly dismissed. Elizabeth was not arrested but was quietly told by church leaders to stay away from services for a period of reflection. 6 weeks later, silence turned to shock. The Savannah Morning Republican published a new notice, the marriage of Elizabeth Thornton and James Bennet. Somehow, Elizabeth had obtained legal freedom papers for James and, in a bold act of defiance, married him in a private ceremony conducted by Reverend John Baker, a Methodist minister known for his abolitionist beliefs. The ceremony didn't take place in a church, but inside the Thornton home itself. The only witnesses were Grace, James's mother, and a visiting lawyer from Philadelphia named Samuel Cooper. Records show that Cooper stayed in Savannah for only 2 nights before leaving for the north, never to return to Georgia. The reaction to the marriage was immediate and fierce. The Savannah City Council held an emergency meeting on April 5, 1839, to address what they called a moral crisis threatening the structure of our society. William Thornton filed a petition declaring his stepmother mentally unfit and demanded control over the estate. Judge Henry Thornton stepped aside from the case due to family ties, but in private letters to the governor, he begged for assistance. The Montgomery family publicly disowned Elizabeth, posting notices in newspapers across Georgia and South Carolina, stating that she was no longer recognized as kin. Much of what happened next has been pieced together from scattered fragments of letters and reports because many official documents were deliberately destroyed, as if someone wanted the entire affair erased from history. A letter discovered in 1954 during the renovation of an old home on Broughton Street described what happened next. Written by someone who called himself a witness to infamy, it told how 12 men rode to the Thornton plantation on the night of April 10th. They surrounded the house, carrying torches, and demanded that James Bennet come out to face justice. But it was the widow who appeared on the porch, holding a shotgun. She spoke only one line, "This is my home and my choice. Leave now or face what comes." Her calm words and the fierce look in her eyes made even the angriest among them hesitate. The men withdrew that night, but returned 2 days later with the sheriff. When they entered the home, they found it completely deserted. Furniture was covered with white sheets, as if everything had been carefully packed away, not abandoned in panic. In one small room off the library, once James's study, there was nothing left at all. not a single paper, book, or note. Sarah Johnson, the former maid, later said that Elizabeth had taught James to read and write in that room, and that they had spent many evenings there together. They cleared it out completely, she said. Not a thing left to show what had happened there all those years. The disappearance of Elizabeth Thornton and James Bennet became known as the Great Savannah Mystery. Rewards were offered, and rumors spread across the South. Some said they had fled north with the help of abolitionists. Others whispered that they were lost at sea. A few believed that their spirits still haunted the old plantation. No proof ever surfaced. Only silence and speculation remained, echoing through Savannah's history like a shadow that refused to fade. It was described as the largest search for missing persons in Chatham County's history. Ports were guarded, roads were checked, and nearby states were notified. William Thornton even hired private detectives from as far away as New York to follow their trail. Yet, despite all these efforts, no confirmed sighting was ever made. It was as if they had vanished into the warm Georgia air. Still, rumors persisted. A train worker in Charleston claimed he saw a white woman and a well-dressed black man boarding a northbound train the morning after the disappearance. A ship captain in Wilmington, Delaware, later said he had carried a mixed-race couple to Boston in late April, though he couldn't be sure from the description that it was them. That summer, a banker in Montreal, Canada, reported that a woman who looked like Elizabeth tried to withdraw money using papers signed by a Philadelphia lawyer, a name that matched Samuel Cooper. After that, there was only silence, and Savannah, with all its charm and ghosts, never forgot the widow who broke the law for love and vanished forever into history's mist. As the years passed and no answers ever came, the scandal slowly changed into something different. It became a whispered tale, a warning told quietly to young women of respected families. The Thornton estate soon fell into decay. William Thornton, after finally gaining full legal control of the property in October 1839, sold it to a family from Virginia and never returned to Savannah again. What happened to the 46 enslaved people left behind was never clearly recorded. However, a document found later in the Chatham County archives shows that at least some of them were sold to a plantation in Alabama. Grace, the mother of James, was not listed among those sold. The investigation might have ended there, forgotten as another unsolved mystery, if not for what was uncovered 5 years later. In 1844, when workers were repairing the old Thornton house for its new owners, they found something disturbing hidden under the floorboards of the small study. Wrapped neatly in oilcloth was a leather-bound journal. The book was handed over to local officials and eventually came into the possession of Judge Henry Thornton, who reportedly read it all at once before locking it away in his private safe. 3 weeks later, the judge died from what doctors called apoplexy, a sudden stroke, likely caused by severe emotional distress. The contents of the journal were never made public. After his death, his widow said she had burned the book without ever reading it, calling it a dangerous thing that carried corruption. But before its destruction, the judge's clerk, a young man named Thomas Wilberforce, later confessed that he had secretly copied certain sections. Wilberforce eventually moved to Boston, became active in abolitionist causes, and shared those copied passages with a Harvard researcher in 1861. The researcher's notes, discovered in Harvard's archives in 1958, stated that the journal had belonged to Elizabeth Thornton and contained entries going back to 1822, the year Grace and her son James first arrived at the plantation. The early pages showed Elizabeth's growing interest in the boy. "The child shows great intelligence," she wrote. "I may indulge my curiosity too much, but there is something in his eyes, a sharpness, a quick mind, that I have not seen in any other child, white or black. Today I showed him my book of pressed flowers, and he remembered every name after hearing it only once." Later entries described Elizabeth's secret decision to teach James to read, even though her husband had strictly forbidden it. R would be furious if he knew. But what harm can come from learning? The boy absorbs every word I show him. He reminds me of myself when I was young, before they told me that a lady's lessons should only be about manners and charm, not knowledge. As the years passed, her writing grew more personal. A page from 1830, when James was about 17, read, "I find myself waiting to see him in the mornings, watching the light touch his face as he works in the garden below my window. I tell myself it is pride, nothing more, but I fear it is something deeper, something I dare not name." By 1835, just before her husband's death, she wrote, "We spoke of poetry today. As he recited Byron, I no longer saw the boy I once taught, but the man he has become. I closed the book and sent him away. Later I cried, though I do not know why." The most revealing passages, according to the Harvard notes, came after Richard Thornton's death. With R gone, the house feels different. Jay and I walked through the garden at dusk, talking about the fields. For the first time, I asked what he thought, not out of politeness, but because I truly wanted to know. Our hands touched as we looked at a damaged camellia bloom. Neither of us spoke of it, yet neither of us moved away. Later we stopped pretending. When the house is quiet and the doors locked, he comes to the library. We read and talk, and I feel seen in a way I never imagined possible. He understands my heart more than anyone ever has. I have begun to ask about laws in other states. There must be a place where we can live without fear. The final copied entry was dated March 30th, 1839, only days before their marriage announcement appeared in the newspaper. "Tomorrow everything changes. Sam Cooper has secured the papers. Once the ceremony is done, we must leave at once. Jay worries for his mother, but she insists on staying behind to keep up appearances until we are safe. I have sewn what jewelry and money I could into our clothing. The northern friends Sam introduced me to have prepared safe houses along our route. I know the risk, but for the first time in my life, I am choosing my own path." The Harvard researcher added a curious note. Wilberforce claimed that in 1852, while visiting Montreal, he met a woman he believed was Elizabeth Thornton. She lived under another name in a quiet neighborhood of mixed families. When he approached her, she denied being Elizabeth, but invited him in for tea. During their conversation, she mentioned her love for poetry, particularly Byron, which reminded him of the journal. Before leaving, he noticed a portrait on her wall of a black man dressed formally. When he asked about it, she smiled softly and said, "My late husband. He passed 3 years ago." Wilberforce never officially reported the encounter. Over time, the Thornton scandal faded from public memory, buried beneath the rising national tensions that would soon lead to civil war. The plantation changed hands twice before it was mostly destroyed during Sherman's march to the sea in 1864. The land was later divided and built upon. Today, a quiet housing area stands where the old mansion once stood, and few living there know what history lies beneath their feet. The Thornton name survives only in a small side street near Abercorn and in the Georgia Historical Society archives, where researchers sometimes stumble upon fragments of the story by chance. In 1957, during the construction of a shopping center near the old plantation site, workers unearthed a small metal box buried about 3 feet underground. Inside were a cameo brooch, a pressed camellia flower between glass, and a folded note tied with a lock of hair. The items were sent to the Georgia Historical Society, where they sat unrecorded for several years. In 1963, Dr. Ellen Hammond examined them as part of her ongoing study into the Thornton mystery. She noted that the cameo matched one from Elizabeth Thornton's wedding portrait. The pressed flower was a rare type of camellia once bred on the plantation, and the lock of hair appeared to come from 2 different people intertwined together. Dr. Hammond never published her findings. Her colleagues said she became obsessed, convinced that more evidence remained hidden. In the spring of 1963, she traveled to Montreal to follow up on the Wilberforce story. In her last letter to her department chair, she wrote that she had made an important discovery and would return with proof that could change Georgia's history. 2 weeks later, her hotel room was found empty, her notes missing. The only thing left behind was a single pressed camellia placed on her pillow. 3 days later, she was found in a hospital, disoriented and unable to remember what had happened or where her research had gone. After that, she abandoned the Thornton case completely and refused to speak of it again until her death in 1968. Now, the story of Elizabeth Thornton and James Bennet exists somewhere between history and legend. Some parts can be confirmed through court papers, newspaper clippings, and family letters. Other parts remain uncertain, built from fragments, whispers, and long gaps in the record. What we know for sure is that in the spring of 1839, a wealthy white widow and a black man, once enslaved under Georgia law, vanished together. They left behind a society in shock, not only because of their defiance of racial boundaries, but because their connection had clearly grown over many years, perhaps even while her husband was still alive, inside a home that symbolized Southern order itself. The true mystery is not only what became of them after they disappeared, but what happened before. What occurred in those quiet hours of teaching and learning, in whispered conversations over books, in the glances shared across rooms where others saw only mistress and servant? What words were spoken? What promises made? And perhaps the most haunting question of all, how many other homes hid stories like theirs behind calm, proper walls? How many other lives crossed the forbidden lines that society worked so hard to maintain? After Dr. Hammond's death, a graduate student sorting through her belongings discovered a sealed envelope with a note requesting it not be opened until 50 years after her passing. The university administration, fearing legal or political consequences, ignored her wish and opened it early in the presence of lawyers. A staff member who witnessed the opening but wished to remain anonymous when interviewed in 1972 said that inside the envelope was a single sheet of paper. On it was an address in Montreal, followed by the words, "They survived. They lived. Their descendants walk among us still." The paper was reportedly taken by university officials and never made public. The address, according to the same witness, led to a cemetery. Even today, the story of Elizabeth Thornton and James Bennet surfaces now and then, in academic discussions, in specialized studies of antebellum Southern society, and in quiet ghost stories told during the evening tours of Savannah's historic district. Tour guides often point to a certain old house near Reynolds Square, not the original Thornton home but one nearby, and claim that on certain nights, especially in April, a faint light can be seen drifting from one room to another, as if someone were searching for something or someone. Others say they've heard a soft voice reciting poetry, though the words are never quite clear. These stories are, of course, tourist editions, tales told to capture the imagination of visitors, but there is no solid proof behind them. What remains certain is this. In 1839, Elizabeth Thornton and James Bennet chose each other in a world that strictly forbade such a choice. Rather than give in to separation, they disappeared. Somewhere, perhaps in a forgotten archive, an old chest in an attic, or buried beneath a modern street, there might still be a clue to what happened after they vanished from history and stepped into legend. Until new evidence appears, their story remains one of Savannah's most haunting and thought-provoking chapters. Not because of ghosts or curses, but because it questioned the very structure of the world they lived in. It showed how fragile those social boundaries really were, and how far people would go, some to protect them and others to break free. As one Harvard researcher who once examined Wilberforce's notes said, "The most disturbing thing about the Thornton case is not what it tells us about those two people, but what it suggests about the countless others whose stories were lost. those who dared to love across forbidden lines, whose courage went unseen, whose voices were silenced, whose names were erased. How many Elizabeth Thorntons and James Bennets lived and died across the South, their quiet defiance buried with them? What does it say about a society that tried so hard to make sure their stories would never surface? These questions still drift through Savannah's moss-covered squares, along its slow river banks, and in the empty spaces between the lines of written history. In 1972, during the renovation of an old colonial post office in Schenectady, New York, workers found a secret compartment behind a loose brick in the basement wall. Inside, they discovered a small leather pouch containing 3 letters addressed to Mrs. Jane Bennet at an Albany address. The letters, written between 1841 and 1843, were signed only with the initial G. Historians later identified the writer as likely being Grace, James Bennet's mother, who was believed to have remained in Georgia after Elizabeth and James escaped. The letters did not mention Savannah directly, but they referred to a mutual friend who had moved north and longed for news from home. The most revealing line came in the 3rd letter, dated December 18, 1843. Our mutual friend asks after you often. Things here have grown harder since your departure. The new master is cruel. Many have been sold away. I still keep the secret you entrusted to me, though some still question me. The item you left in my care is safe where we agreed. When my time comes, I hope to join you in a place where people may live by their hearts and not by others' commands. These letters were significant not only for what they said, but for what they implied. They hinted that Grace may have eventually escaped north, contradicting official records that claimed she died on the Thornton plantation in 1840. More importantly, they suggested an ongoing line of communication, a hidden network that allowed messages to move between Georgia and New York, despite efforts to sever all links between Elizabeth, James, and their past. Further evidence of this secret network appeared in 1959 when a historian studying the Underground Railroad uncovered financial ledgers belonging to Samuel Cooper, the Philadelphia lawyer who had witnessed Elizabeth and James's marriage. These account books, found in the archives of a Quaker meeting house in Pennsylvania, contained coded entries later decoded as financial support for escape routes used by enslaved people. One entry dated June 5, 1839, read, "Special arrangement for TNB package delivered safely to Montreal. Additional funds released as agreed for 5 years of protection and silence." Dr. Marcus Williams, who examined these ledgers before they were restricted from public view in 1962, wrote in his private notes, "The Cooper accounts suggest that the Thornton-Bennett escape was not an act of sudden rebellion, but a carefully planned operation that took years to prepare. The amount of funding, enough to secure 5 years of safety and secrecy, indicates not only great resources, but also extraordinary organization." One must wonder when Elizabeth first began planning her departure from Savannah society. Was it after her husband's death or much earlier? This question grew even more intriguing in 1964, when workers demolishing an old rice mill near the original Thornton estate uncovered a small hidden space beneath the floorboards. Inside was a wooden chest containing what appeared to be teaching materials: a child's primer, a slate, several pencils, and a worn copy of Byron's collected poems. Experts dated these items to the 1820s or early 1830s, before Richard Thornton's death. Most striking of all was a small notebook filled with handwriting practice, the same line repeated over and over in steadily improving penmanship. "I am James Bennet. I am a man. I have a mind." At the bottom of that page, in a different handwriting believed to be Elizabeth's, were the words, "Excellent progress. You have earned your name today." This note strongly suggested that Elizabeth had been secretly teaching James to read and write long before her husband's death. The old rice mill, according to plantation records, was rarely used after 1825, when newer machinery was installed nearer to the main fields. That made it the perfect hiding place for secret lessons, far enough from the main house to avoid suspicion, yet not so distant as to raise questions about Elizabeth's absence. What no one has been able to determine is when or how their connection shifted from teacher and student to something more profound. No direct documents confirm their romantic relationship before Richard Thornton's death, but a letter Elizabeth wrote to her cousin Anne Montgomery on October 18, 1834, 2 years before she became a widow, contains a cryptic passage that many historians interpret as a veiled reference to it. I live 2 lives now, one that the world sees, where I perform my duties as expected, and another made up of moments stolen from the day, conversations that must not be overheard, thoughts I dare not say. It is in that secret life that I feel most truly alive. Is it not strange to feel most real when one must hide the most? The hidden life she described became much harder to maintain after her husband's death. As a widow, Elizabeth would have been under far greater scrutiny, especially concerning her management of the estate and the people she now legally owned. Several contemporary witnesses noted shifts in her demeanor. Margaret Williams, a neighbor whose private diary was found in 1957, wrote in September 1836, "Visited Elizabeth Thornton 6 months after her husband's death. She seems changed in a way I cannot explain. There is a restlessness about her that does not match her calm appearance. When I said it must be difficult to manage such a large estate alone, she smiled strangely and said, 'I am not as alone as you might think.' I left with a sense of unease, as though I had glimpsed something I should not have." As more people began noticing Elizabeth's unusual behavior, James Bennet's position within the household also transformed. By early 1838, witnesses claimed he had taken on responsibilities far beyond what was typical for someone of his standing. The kitchen maid, Sarah Johnson, later told investigators that he managed the estate's accounts, received visitors when Elizabeth was unavailable, and even corresponded with merchants in Savannah under her instruction. "He sat at the master's desk," she said, "used the master's pen, spoke with the master's confidence. And Mrs. Elizabeth, she only smiled like she knew exactly what she was doing. It all seemed the most natural thing in the world." This slow reshaping of roles, this quiet breaking down of rigid Southern boundaries, could not continue indefinitely without bringing consequences. The turning point came, as history records, with William Thornton's unexpected visit in January 1839. What exactly he saw remains uncertain, but in a letter he sent to Judge Henry Thornton shortly after fleeing the estate, he described it as a disturbance of nature's order so great that I could not remain under that roof another hour without fearing I might lose control. He said he found Elizabeth and James in a situation that left no room for innocence, though he refrained from providing specifics, perhaps out of shame or a desire to preserve the family's reputation. What followed set in motion the chain of events that led to Elizabeth and James's brief marriage and later disappearance. What few realize is that during the 3 months between that visit and the wedding, Elizabeth quietly began selling her assets and transferring her wealth. Records from the Bank of Savannah show that between January 20th and March 15th, 1839, she withdrew substantial sums, converting them into easily hidden forms like banknotes and letters of credit. She also sold jewelry through a broker in Charleston, a transaction proven by a receipt found among Samuel Cooper's papers. Most intriguing of all was that she transferred ownership of a small property she had inherited in Philadelphia to a company with Cooper as its sole trustee. That act, simple on the surface, may have been the final piece in the plan that allowed her and James Bennet to vanish, not just from Savannah, but from the reach of history itself. Their story, preserved in fragments of letters, diaries, ledgers, and whispered recollections, continues to echo across time. Whether as fact or legend, It reminds us that even in the darkest chapters of history, there were those who dared to love, to learn, and to live as equals when the world said they could not. These actions make it clear that Elizabeth was preparing not just to run away, but to begin an entirely new life beyond Georgia. The careful legal steps she took through others and across state borders show that she fully understood the dangers ahead. She and James needed not only to escape, but also to build new identities in a place where their past could not reach them, where they could live freely without fear of being discovered or rejected. The strongest proof of these preparations appears in a statement from 1841 by a former clerk at a Savannah print shop. During a court dispute over William Thornton's claim to his stepmother's estate, the clerk testified that in February 1839, a well-dressed black man, later identified as James Bennet, had ordered business cards and stationery for a Mr. James Bennet, importer of fine teas and spices, with an address in Montreal. Bennet told the clerk he was arranging this for his employer, who was expanding trade in the North. The clerk thought little of it then, but later realized what it meant once the scandal spread. Those business cards were not just a disguise. They represented the life Elizabeth and James had dreamed of together, one where he would be not a servant, but a businessman, not property, but a respected man of trade. The choice of Montreal was clever. As part of British Canada, it was far removed from American laws about runaway slaves. Its mixed population offered a kind of safety, and its role as a major trading city made a tea and spice business completely believable. The exact details of their journey from Savannah to Montreal remain uncertain, though bits of evidence suggest they traveled by ship to Philadelphia, where Cooper sheltered them briefly and arranged new identity papers. From there, they likely moved north through New York and crossed into Canada. Among Cooper's belongings, a receipt was found for passage on the schooner Mary Jane from Savannah to Philadelphia, dated April 12, 1839. It listed two travelers, Mrs. E. Smith and Mr. J. Smith, described as aunt and nephew on family business. What seems certain is that by August of that same year, someone matching Elizabeth's description tried to access funds in Montreal. Later that year, city directories recorded a James Bennet, importer, with a small shop on Rue St. Paul and a home on Rue Antoine. The following year listed a Mrs. Jane Bennet at the same address. No mention was made of their race or origin. Life in Montreal would have brought its own struggles. Though they had escaped the danger of Southern law, they now had to build believable lives around their new names. Elizabeth's accent, their appearance, and their manners would all need to fit the roles they created. Their success depended not only on skill but also on how convincingly they could appear as who they claimed to be. From what remains, it seems they managed well. Records from the Port of Montreal show that Bennett's tea and spice business had steady activity through the 1840s. Tax papers reveal slow but sure growth, and by 1845, they had moved to a larger shop. Church records from a small Methodist congregation note regular attendance and donations from Mr. and Mrs. Bennet, described as a couple of mixed background, vague enough to avoid suspicion. The most personal glimpse into their Montreal life comes from the diary of a young woman named Marie Leblanc, who worked in their shop from 1843 to 1845. Found in 1966, her journal offers small but touching notes about her employers. Madame Bennet speaks French with an American accent, she wrote, but tries very hard to improve. She is always graceful, even in simple clothes, and treats everyone kindly, from wealthy customers to poor vendors. Mr. Bennet runs the shop carefully, and they seem quietly devoted to each other. They share looks when they think no one is watching, small signs of understanding that make me wish for the same one day. In another entry, Marie described a tense moment. A customer from Boston asked Mr. Bennet about his past. He said he had grown up in the South but preferred the air of Canada, both weather and society. The man then asked if Madame Bennet was of European descent. Silence filled the shop. Mr. Bennet smiled and said, "My wife and I have found Montreal asks fewer questions, which is exactly why we chose it." The customer soon left, but Marie noticed Madame Bennet's hands trembling as she arranged the tea canisters, though she tried to appear calm. This moment showed how fragile their safety truly was. Even in their new home, one curious visitor from the South could have ruined everything. This constant risk likely led them to sell their business in 1849 and move to a quieter town outside Montreal. Their old shop was bought by a French-Canadian trader, and their home address vanished from city lists. After that, the record grows thin. No definite proof survives of James Bennet's reported death from pneumonia around 1849, though that account came from Thomas Wilberforce after meeting Elizabeth. Death records from that period were often incomplete, especially outside major cities. What can be confirmed is that in 1852, the year Wilberforce said he met Elizabeth, a Mrs. Jane Bennet, widow, bought a small house in St. Henry, then a separate town west of Montreal. The property stayed in her name until 1867, when it passed to a Miss Grace Bennet, listed as her niece and only heir. Grace's appearance raises questions. There is no record of Elizabeth and James having or adopting a child, but the name Grace matches that of James's mother. Could she have been James's mother who somehow found her way north? Or was she a daughter born to the couple and named after her grandmother? The second seems more likely, supported by a church record noting the confirmation in 1860 of a Grace Bennet, age 14, which would place her birth around 1846, 7 years after their escape from Savannah. If true, it means their story was not only one of a forbidden union, but also of a family built across the barriers of race and class that shaped 19th century America. Somewhere there may still be descendants of Elizabeth Thornton and James Bennet, unaware of the extraordinary courage and hope that defined their ancestors' lives. The last known trace of Elizabeth appears in 1869, 30 years after her scandal shook Savannah. A notice in a Montreal newspaper announced the death of Mrs. Jane Bennet, formerly of the United States, aged 72. The short obituary said she was survived by her beloved granddaughter and remembered for her quiet strength, her love of poetry, and her belief that all souls are equal before God. She was buried in a small cemetery in St. Henri, in a grave she had purchased years before. Beside it was another grave, unmarked except for the years 1822-1849, likely the span of James Bennet's life. In 1963, when Dr. Ellen Lena Hammond traveled to Montreal following Wilberforce's notes, she reportedly visited that same cemetery. Whatever she discovered disappeared along with her research papers during her mysterious 3-day absence. By 1970, the cemetery was relocated for city development, and the graves were moved without individual markers, erasing the last physical link to their story. All that remains today are fragments scattered in archives across Georgia, New York, Pennsylvania, and Quebec, testimonies spoken long after the events, objects found under floors or behind walls, lines in diaries and letters never meant for public eyes. From these pieces, we can trace the outline of something extraordinary, a quiet act of defiance against the boundaries of race and status. What stays unclear is not what Elizabeth and James did, but who they truly were to each other. When did teacher and student become equals? When did respect turn into something deeper? What promises were whispered in secret rooms? What gave them the strength to imagine a life everyone said was impossible? These unanswered questions fill the spaces between the surviving records. They echo through Savannah's history, unsettling its polished image of the Old South. The story of Elizabeth Thornton and James Bennet offers no simple ending, no easy moral. It reminds us of the countless untold stories buried beneath official history, The quiet rebellions, the secret understandings, the human hearts that refuse to obey the lines drawn for them. As one Harvard researcher later wrote, "What makes the Thornton affair so haunting is not that it happened, but that it makes us wonder how many others did too." If a woman of Elizabeth's standing could risk everything for such a bond, how many others felt the same but lacked her courage or means? The real history of human connection across the divides of class and color in America remains mostly unwritten, existing only in fragments, whispers, and silence. In 1969, the same year Dr. Hammond's sealed envelope was opened, an elderly woman visited the Georgia Historical Society, asking for any materials about the Thornton plantation. The archivist described her as well-dressed, in her 70s, with light brown skin and gray eyes. She spent hours reading the records, taking notes. When asked about her interest, she said she was tracing her family roots. As she left, she stopped at the display case holding the cameo brooch and pressed flower found in 1957. She stood there quietly for a long moment, then smiled. Not sadly, but as if remembering something deeply personal. She touched the glass lightly and said, "Some stories are better left untold, but that doesn't make them any less true." She never returned, and her name was never recorded. Like so much of this story, she remains another fragment, another echo from a past that refuses to fade. In the end, perhaps this is what makes the Thornton Bennett story so powerful: the endurance of human connection, the refusal of love in any form to obey the rules society builds around it. In a world that declared certain feelings impossible, Elizabeth and James created a small space for themselves, first in secret, then in exile, and finally in memory. Even today, the traces they left behind can still move us. In Savannah, on certain April nights, when the air is thick with jasmine and memory, guides still point to Reynolds Square and speak softly of the widow who defied her world. Some say they see lights in old windows, hear faint poetry recited, or feel a sudden chill in the warm air. They are just stories told to entertain visitors seeking a touch of mystery. But beneath them lies a deeper truth. The past is never as simple as we wish it were. Human hearts have always refused to be contained. And perhaps somewhere, the descendants of Elizabeth Thornton and James Bennett still walk among us, carrying within them a quiet legacy of courage and defiance that even time itself could not erase. Peace.